Good afternoon. Big news day, Thursday. It's obviously a huge weekend, which highlights and starts tonight at least with the Bulldogs and Brisbane. I'll get to that up at the Gabba, an important game, particularly, well, for both sides really. Brisbane's been in different form as well. But I'll start with the big story today. It's Clayton Oliver, and it's a massive one for Melbourne fans. Melbourne revealing this morning in somewhat of a surprise that Oliver has re-signed to the end of 2030. Yep, 2030. It's a 7-year deal that'll make Oliver a demon for life. He'll finish up, or that'll at least take him through to when he's 33 years of age. He was up at the end of the next season in terms of his contract, but it means he won't obviously enter that free agency year. Melbourne did the same thing with Petrarca, just took the free agency effectively off the table by offering a landmark deal. I understand that Oliver's deal will be on par with Petrarca's. Certainly is in terms of length and security, and I think it absolutely will be in terms of money, circa $1 million a year. You can mark that one down, I think, pretty conservatively, and obviously it would have ratchet clauses and all the like for things like TPP increases and those types of things. It's obviously richly deserved. He's a 3-time best and fairest, Clayton Oliver, arguably the best player currently in the game, a 2-time All-Australian, and currently has one flag. Who knows by the end of that 7-year deal how that record and ledger will look, but I dare say it will be much improved because he's an absolute beauty. I asked one player manager this morning, why did Melbourne do that deal? And their response was, because he's a good player. I think that pretty much sums it up. He's probably the best player in the game. An easy deal, I guess, for Melbourne, and certainly a great reward for Clayton Oliver in terms of security. He'll be one of the top paid players in the game for his entire career, and it's a great announcement as far as Melbourne's concerned today. The AFL is certainly cognizant and across the fan piece at the moment, in particular the crowd levels. You'll have seen articles in recent weeks discussing why people aren't necessarily coming to the football to the levels with which fans were, particularly pre-COVID. I know Carlton and St Kilda this week is Friday night from a general admission point of view is sold out. I think the AFL was very pleased with the crowd between Richmond and Geelong. That interesting slot about 4:30 last Saturday afternoon, but notwithstanding that, crowds have been off. And I spoke to Gil McLaughlin about this issue one-on-one last night. They're looking very, very closely next season now at 7 or 7:20 starts for Friday nights, at least bringing that forward. It was sort of put back to allow families to get home, get ready and get into the football. But I think the AFL's view now is it does finish particularly late on a Friday night. By the time you get home from the footy, particularly if you've taken public transport, it's a late night Friday night. So certainly for the eastern states, they're looking at 7 or 7:20 Friday night fixtures for next season. Gill also confirming it'll be a fixed fixture for at least the first 15 rounds next season, which I think will be popular with fans and popular with clubs as well. There was a big push from the clubs to make that a fixed fixture. By fixed, I mean date, time, venue. Lock it in the first 15 rounds. The AFL will release that at the start of the season, have less fixture releases next year. I spoke to Gil McLaughlin also about the send-off rule in that interview, and he's absolutely dead set against it. Thinks it's hard to adjudicate. The AFL's been consistent with that position all week, following obviously Prestia's sickening concussion on Saturday night against the Cats, but the AFL certainly against that send-off rule. But the AFL looking at all sorts of initiatives at the moment to bring fans back to the football. I know there's lots of factors being discussed. Obviously the paperless ticketing, the electronic ticketing's been, I think, a bit controversial and fumbly with fans. That hasn't been particularly popular either. So you'll be able to use paper ticketing as well next season. But just repeating that, 7 or 7:20 starts for Friday nights next year. That's the AFL looking closely at that, and a fixed fixture for at least the first 15 rounds. Trade news is beginning to heat up, particularly given the number of players out of contract this year. It's, I think, a record number, or pretty much close to it. Colin Young, one of the top agencies from Western Australia, has been in Victoria this week. I think he's now in South Australia. He manages Rory Lobb, who effectively wanted to get out of Fremantle, or was least interested in coming to the Eastern States last year. Lobb's been linked to all sorts of clubs, but I can now link him to strong interest, I understand, from the Bulldogs. So obviously they've got English going in the ruck there. Martin's not playing. They've tried with Sweet. But I think it's certainly the Bulldogs' view and a view from recruiters that if they could get Lobb as a ruckman or backup ruckman into the ruck, they'd have a pretty good goal-to-goal line, and then maybe they need an additional defender. But if they could get an additional ruckman with all their midfielders, they'd be a serious threat next season. Luke Beveridge, a highly regarded coach. I think he's a pretty highly regarded list guy as well. He's right across all that with Sam Power at the Bulldogs. And I think the Bulldogs certainly interested in Rory Lobb. Colin Young was in town this week speaking to a whole host of clubs, but I think you can mark down interest from the Bulldogs in Rory Lobb. I mentioned discussion around the send-off rule this week. The AFL certainly against that idea. But there's a lot of discussion still around concussion. There's background work going on at the moment from Peter Gordon and his firm into effectively like an investigation on whether there should be a concussion fund or a dedicated concussion fund in particular for past players and how that should be administered. He's looking at how past players are being looked after. But his firm is also helping with the investigation into Professor Paul McCrory, who's advised in regards to a lot of the AFL's policies before. The AFL's launched an investigation into him. They announced that a couple of months ago. We've covered it on this podcast. But by way of update, and there's certainly no assertion of any guilt or impropriety on Macquarie's part, there's an investigation going on and we need to wait for the results of that. But the AFL has written to a lot of the past players that were treated by him in that period, including John Platten, and they've been invited to participate in interviews now and explain the terms of reference of that investigation. And I think a lot of those past players now participating in that process. So that AFL investigation, which I must say I've seen the terms of reference, looks pretty thorough from an AFL perspective, has ramped up significantly in the background in recent weeks. And some of those past players have been invited to participate in that AFL investigation in terms of just clarifying some of the treatment and issues that went on in relation to that issue over the last 10 years or so. And I'll whip through some just to finish off with today. As I mentioned, game day, it's pretty exciting tonight. Interesting for the Bulldogs. Caleb Daniels out with cartilage damage. They don't know how long he'll be out for, which is a significant blow for the Bulldogs against Brisbane tonight. But Lockie Hunter, this is a great story. He's a good player. I really like Lockie. He is back for the first time since his personal leave in round 5. So it's a big boost in that regards for the Bulldogs. Zorko and Bailey, talk about important players, those two are back for the Lions. That'll be an absolute beauty. Thursday night football tonight up in Brisbane. Craig McRae spoken this morning. De Goey should play. Jordan De Goey should play this weekend. A hugely important clash for Collingwood. If they can just solidify that spot in the 8, albeit against the Suns, it'll be a tough matchup there. De Goey's a huge boost for them. Having said that, there's a drawback. That's Jeremy Howe has got a stomach virus and won't play, according to Craig McRae this weekend. So Darcy Moore and his defenders will be sort of one out in that regard. Howe's he's one of the best defenders in the game. They did flag also, Collingwood, that Brodie Grundy will be later than round 18. Now, if Grundy could come in and have an impact later in the season, particularly at the pointy end, that would be hugely important for Collingwood. But it doesn't sound like he'll be... he's tracking probably a little bit slower than we perhaps thought, and Craig McRae revealed that this morning. I was at Richmond training. Dustin Martin is right to go. He's fine. He didn't train Tuesday, was just given the day off. Damien Harvey didn't go into the reasons for that, but Dusty is right to go for the Tigers, who, interestingly, they can clearly match it with the best. They proved that against Geelong last weekend, but they do find themselves outside the 8 and have an important clash against West Coast, who are playing a bit better. We've seen that. They beat Essendon last week, West Coast. So, look, you expect Richmond to win, but having said that, West Coast are clearly playing better. A lot of discussion this week regarding North's review, which is being conducted by Jeff Walsh. I revealed last week Jeff Walsh's formal involvement with the club. Sonia Hood is the president. She's got the strong backing of a lot of influential North people, Sonia Hood, including Peter Scanlon, who's a famous businessman who's donated a huge amount of the money in terms of retiring the debt at North Melbourne. Sonia, very firmly in control. She's running things, Sonia, and I'm told doing a very good job, and had an open letter to the members this week, explaining that their patience is wearing thin and their form is deeply concerning. They suffered their 12th consecutive defeat last week, and now they've got Geelong in Geelong. So it's going to be interesting to see what the outcome of that review is. Eddie Maguire on Footy Classified spoke very highly in regards to Jeff Walsh's expertise, football expertise on Footy Classified last night. I dare say that based on these results, David Noble is in a huge degree of trouble, simply on account of the results. It's hard being a rebuild coach, but just in terms of whispers around the traps this week, that's certainly the strong word. Alistair Clarkson, of course, he's an old shinboner linked to North Melbourne. I'm not sure whether Clarko would go back to North Melbourne. Perhaps he would be more inclined to go back to North Melbourne if his friend Mark Brayshaw came in as the CEO. Having said that, they're both involved in the medical marijuana business at the moment, which I think has got huge promise, and they're doing well in that area. So whether Mark Brayshaw would go and do that job, or there's any interest in him doing that job, look, that's all speculative. But they're the sort of names bandied about, getting Clarko, bringing Mark Brayshaw. Having said that, all that, Ben Amafio is the current CEO, and the terms of reference to the review are into the football department. And Sonia explained that to to Jeff Walsh, I'm told, on Monday when he came for the first day of his review. So I think for the moment, Ben Amafio is not being reviewed himself. So I think some of the commentary regarding his position might have been unfair this week, but look, that's not for me to comment on in that regard. North clearly need to improve. And just finally, it was the AFLW draft last night. There were 83 players drafted. There were 2 sets of twins in the first round that got drafted, including Zoe Wakefer, who travelled to Melbourne to support her sister Lauren. But in the end, Zoe was picked up by West Coast as well. So that was a good story. And Damien Fleming's daughter, Jasmine, was picked up by the Hawks, and I'm reliably informed that Fleming is a massive Hawks supporter. So he'd be absolutely wrapped in that regard. That was a great... I was there last night at the AFL for the start of the AFLW draft. It was a record night in terms of participants, apart from the first year of the competition, with 4 new teams this year. And as I said, 83 players drafted, which is, that's a career start for 83 people. And I think it's absolutely magnificent, a great story. And just finally, in terms of a left field one today, I mentioned last week, The Age, and Sam McClure gave an update, I think, on Classified last night in his column, that some of the club presidents have been contacted in regards to who they think would be appropriate to fill Gil McLachlan's shoes and replace Gil McLachlan. In the background, that process is actually now quite advanced. I think the interviews have started. I'm told Brendan Gale's involved in that interview process, which is no great surprise. I'm also told that the net has been cast a little bit wider than some people think. So clearly you've got Andrew Dillon in there, Travis Auld, Brendan Gale from Richmond. Tom Harley's name has come up. I mentioned Patrick Delaney's name on this podcast before Gil stepped down. In fact, a week or just days before Gil stepped down earlier in the year. He's the boss of Foxtel and would be a good left field candidate as well. So that race in the background genuinely heating up. It's been a busy news day. Thanks so much for listening to my podcast. I'll be back tomorrow for all the fallout from tonight, and there'll be lots more news, no doubt. Triple M rocks football.